Do you guys have any chance to try any of the questions this week? Of course not. Do you remember what the 2 questions are that we learned so much?
What do you mean by that?
What do you mean by that?
How did you get to
And
that?
how did you come to that conclusion? So this week will be a little bit of a shift from what really is more like defensive questions. You're just kind of leading them down the path. He's going to show us how to be a little more offensive with questions, where it's just leading people in a direction you want them to go with questions, which is a little more complicated. It's a little, you have to know where you're trying to go.
Yes.
So he's got a lot of real world examples. So we may not get through this whole session today. We'll just, those are too much fun. So we'll just go as far as we can go. At 3:30 we'll stop and we'll pick it up next week wherever we left off. So we'll probably get out of sequence with the videos, but I think that's okay. The examples are actually too good to rush through. Next week is going to be a lot of them. So we'll probably take at least 2 weeks on next week's. So, okay. So this is the third in the Columbos. This is session 3. And being able to give clear answers to these questions demonstrates your mastery of the information. So if you have a chance and you have to go through the interactive questions, it just kind of rehashes what the last 2 sessions were. So we're going to listen to Greg, and then we'll go through his kind of highlights that he wants to kind of stress in the study guide. Go ahead.
Hi, Greg Hochul here with Stand to Reason, and this is our 3rd session together, learning the tactical approach. I hope that you had a good time in the last couple of weeks, maybe, taking some of the stuff that we've learned and talked about and putting it into play and getting comfortable with it. Let's take a moment and talk about what we discussed last session. Last session, I introduced you to the second use of the Columbo tactic. That would be the second step in our game plan, and I call that reversing the burden of proof. Remember the rule that we talked about: the one who makes the claim bears the burden, which means we're not going to let the other side have any free rides. We're not going to let them get away with just making assertions, okay? We want the rationale. The next thing that I taught you was to avoid a kind of a trap. I called it the professor's ploy, in which the burden of proof is reversed upon you when you didn't make the claim. And I told you, don't ever allow someone else to make you disprove his or her view. It's their job to defend their own view with their own reasons and evidence first before you have to step up. Cool. Okay, and I told you also what to do when you didn't know what to do. This whole approach, our game plan, is a relaxed game plan. It's a don't push it game plan. It's a gardening game plan. So if you don't know where to go next, don't sweat it. If you don't see an opening, no big deal. Do what you can. Let the rest go. There's no need to force the conversation. The last thing that we talked about when we were together last time is I showed you how to use the Columbo tactic defensively to keep you out of the hot seat. So sometimes you're going to find yourself outmatched, somebody else that's drilling you with a lot of extra information you don't know how to handle. Go immediately into student mode. Even take notes if you have to. Invite the other person to tell you what they believe and why they believe it. Now you're the learner. You're not trying to persuade. Tell them you'll think about it, and then think about it. Work on it on your own when the pressure is off, and it's just a lot easier to do that. So that's what we talked about last time. Here's what I want to talk about in the 3rd session. I want to complete the game plan, basically. I want to teach you the 3rd step in the Columbo tactic, the 3rd use of Columbo. And that 3rd use is using questions to make a point, or using questions to lead someone somewhere. I'm going to show you, in addition to that, some very specific ways that you can improve your use of Columbo. And finally, I want to show you how to defend against the Columbo tactic when somebody else uses it with you. So let's talk for a moment about the 3rd step. We talked about the 1st step of the game plan. All you're going to worry about is gathering information. You're going to use the question, what do you mean by that? The next step, when people make a claim or an assertion, then we reverse the burden of proof on the person who's making the claim. We use the question, now how did you come to that conclusion, or some version of that? Okay? Here's the third use of Columbo. In the first two uses, by the way, we didn't need to know anything but the questions, and that's why it's such a good game plan. In the third use of Columbo, you got to know something. If you're going to use questions to make a point, you got to know the point that you're going to make. Think of it like you have a target, and target is the point you want to make. The questions that you use are going to be arrows shooting at the target, so you have to have the target in view. Now, there are two different ways that you can use this, two different kinds of targets, I guess is the best way to put it. You can use questions to advance your own point of view. So let's say you want to make a point. How do you do that? Use the Columbo tactic. We'll talk about how to do that. Secondly, you can use your questions to exploit a weakness or a flaw. That means you can help a person see where he or she went wrong in their thinking. Let me go back just for a moment to something I said a moment ago. In the first two uses of Columbo, you don't need to know anything but the questions. That's the strength of it for beginners. If you want to use Columbo in a more aggressive way, the third use of Columbo, you're going to make a point. You need to know the point you want to make. You need to know, say, the solution to the problem, if there's a problem in view. And let's just say the question is, why is Jesus the only way? So you want to make the case, or at least you want to explain why Jesus is the only way of salvation. So what do you need to know in that one? You need to know why Jesus is the only way of salvation. If you don't know that, then you can't go further. You got to know the answer to the question, but you also have to know how you're going to get there. So there are pieces to this explanation that you need to have in place. Now, let me tell you a secret about the pieces. If you take the pieces and you place them out one after another, and they lead to your conclusion, it is going to be very easy for the other person, especially if they're a little bit of a kind of aggravated as a skeptic. In other words, they're not playing ball with you very much. They're having conversation, but they're not coming along easily. Then they're going to find something wrong with everything that you say. You're going to have to put pieces on the table to get to your conclusion. In this case, how Jesus or why Jesus is the only way of salvation. But they're not going to let you finish because they're going to start taking exception with the pieces that you put out there to make your case. There's a way around this, and you can call it a trick if you want to. It's tricky, but it's not abusive. And the thing is you want to get as much as possible the other person to put the pieces on the table for you. You want to ask the kind of questions that will get them to affirm these pieces that you are going to use eventually to lead to your point. Now, if they're going to affirm those pieces, you can see, can't you, how hard it's going to be for them to take them off the table. They're their points. They've already said yes to them. They can't go back later and deny them. That's a lot more difficult for them to do. So let me show you what I mean, especially with this issue about Jesus being the only way. One of the first books I wrote was featured at Barnes & Noble, and they had me come in and give a presentation for the book. And it's the thing where the author talks about the books, answers questions, and then signs some books. Well, somebody had been standing off to the side in the maybe the religion section or whatever, and had heard some of the things I had to say. So that person came up to me and asked me a question. They said, "Why do I need to believe in Jesus? I'm Jewish," he said. I try to live as best that I can. I believe in God. So why do I need your Jesus? So that's the question, right? It can be phrased lots of different ways, but this is, why is Jesus the only way of salvation? So now I need to explain this to him, but I know I need to put some pieces on the table. So I said to him, "Do you mind if I ask you a couple questions?" He said, "No, go ahead." I said, "Here's the question." I said, first question. I said, "Do you think the people who do bad things ought to be punished?" He thought for a moment, and then he said, "Well, since I'm a prosecuting attorney, yes." Now, I got lucky in the attorney part. I didn't know that about him, but most people do have this intuition, this deep understanding of justice, that people who do bad things ought to pay for them. Okay, so good. People who do bad things ought to pay. I agree with you, I said to him. So we got a piece on the table that he put there, but I agree with it. Okay, great. Second question. Have you ever done any bad things? That's what I asked him. He paused for a moment and then said, "Well, yeah, I guess I have." Now, if he would have said he's never done any bad things, I would have said, "Can I talk to your wife? Everybody's done bad things. We all know this." And he was just being honest with me. Okay, fine. There's another piece on the table. I said, I agree with you. I said, now, do you know where we've gotten here? Look where we've come in just 2 questions. This is what I said to him. I said, we both believe that people who do bad things ought to be punished, and we both believe that we've done those things. Do you know what I call that? I asked him. He said, what? I said, I call that bad news. Now you think about it for a moment. Do I have to tell this man that he's a sinner, I guess? He said, no, he's already told me. Do I have to tell him that he's under judgment? No, he's already told me. Now, he doesn't know where I'm going with this. He wasn't thinking about that when he walked into the Barnes & Noble. But because I asked him a very specific question that had a very straightforward, reasonable, understandable response, he gave it to me. Now I got this stuff on the table. And I told him, well, it's like you and I are both standing in the dock. And the judge, God, is there ready to deliver sentence on us, and we know we deserve it. And then God pauses and he says, hey, fellas, do either of you care about a pardon right now? Are you interested in clemency right now? I want you to see what just happened there, friend. What I did was I gathered some things that were things that he already knew. They're built into him. And now I'm using them to help him feel the force of the problem so he can feel the force of the solution. He and I are both in trouble. God is offering a way out. So what's the way out? The way out is that God became a man himself and initiated a rescue operation, living the life that we should have lived, and then getting in the docket for us so that he could take the punishment that we deserve. That's what I explained to him. I think I might have said something about Jesus taking the rap for our crimes against God. Notice the language I'm using. Why am I talking like that? Well, because he's an attorney. This is his language. It's also biblical language. The reason that Jesus is the only way is because he's the only one who solved the problem. Either he stands in the docket, gets our punishment, or we take our own punishment. That's it. If we say yes to Jesus, we're forgiven. If we say no to Jesus, then we get what we deserve to get. So there's the full expanded explanation. But do you see how I got there? I knew the explanation. I understood the problem. And I was able to explain it to somebody in non-religious terms. But what did I do to get there? I used some questions to get some important pieces on the table before I could move forward with my argument. So now you're beginning to see, if you want to go an advanced and more effective way of using Columbo, you've got to know some things. You've got to know answers to challenges. You've got to know some arguments. And you're going to get that by reading or listening or talking with other Christians. However you get it, doesn't matter. Once you get it, you want to know how you can express it in a way that others can understand it. And then as much as possible, you want to get the pieces that you need on the table by asking questions. The questions are really critical. Even though you're making a point, it keeps them engaged. Okay? Now let's take another example. Somebody at a Q&A session once asked, or actually said, give me, the way he put it was, prove to me that God exists. Prove to me God exists. Now, that kind of put me on the spot. I'm there answering questions. I'm the apologist, and somebody says, prove to me God exists. It's kind of like saying you're a comedian, and somebody says, okay, be funny, like right now. Well, here's what I said to him. I said, before I go any further, I've got to repair some problem that are in your challenge. What's that? Well, you said prove. I don't know what you would count as evidence. And unless I have an idea of what would count as evidence to you, there's no sense in me giving anything that I think is a proof. And this is something you ought to keep in mind too, friends. This is, if you have somebody say, prove this or that, and you don't solve this problem, you can put evidence before them all day long, and they can just simply say, that's not what? Proof, okay? So you got to clear that up. The second thing I pointed out to him is you said, prove to me. So you want me to give you a line of thinking that is so powerful that it will even convert you. Well, I don't know what your barriers are, what your objections are, what are the kinds of things that would resonate with you. So I asked him, can you put the challenge in a little different way that doesn't put me at such a disadvantage? And incidentally, this kind of bargaining with people is entirely okay. It's a fair request. And so he said, well, maybe, can you give me some good reason that God exists? Okay, well, that was much better. I said, yeah, I think I can do that. Okay, but I have to ask you a few questions first. Now, what do I need to know before I go forward in this conversation with this guy? I need to know a good reason that God exists, right? When I know the good reason God exists, I know the steps that get me there. Then I'm going to try to have him help me by affirming the steps, put the pieces in place before I kind of get to the punchline, so to speak. All right? So here's the question I asked him. First one, I said, and in these questions I told him are kind of simple, but just bear with me. Do you think that things exist? He said, yeah, things exist. Okay, things exist. We both agree with that. Okay, here was my second question. Do you think that the things that exist have always existed? Or did they come into existence at some point of time? Now, he said, no, they haven't always existed. And there's hardly anybody around anymore that's thought about this very much, that thinks the universe is eternal, all right? That's a dead and gone idea. And partly because of the force of Big Bang cosmology. So again, I think this is something that some Christians are uncomfortable with, but just keep in mind, that's what they believe. So let's just work with that. We can use it to our advantage. No, he said, I think that things came into existence at some point in time. Big Bang, fine. I agree with you, I said. Okay, fine. So we're both in agreement about these two things on the table. Now the third question, I said to him, and this is the one that really matters. All those things that came into existence, what caused them to come into existence? And there he paused for a moment. And some people will say, well, look, what do I know? I'm not a scientist. I'm not a who am I to say? And I say, wait a minute, it's not really that hard. It's simple. There are only two possibilities. Either something caused the universe to come into existence, or no thing caused the universe to come into existence. It's just that simple. There are no other alternatives. Either something or no thing. What say you? Okay, now, for me as a questioner, I'm in a very, very good spot, because I have moved him with information he's given me to a point where now he has to make a decision, and he's stuck because he doesn't want to say that something caused the universe, because the minute he says something caused the universe, it would have to be something that is outside of the universe. You see that, right? Outside of the space-time continuum. Not something natural, but something at least supranatural, maybe supernatural. And that immediately is an assault on his maybe atheistic, materialistic point of view. He didn't want to go there. And also it would have to be not just something outside of the material universe, but something that's really powerful and probably really smart and probably personal, and there are other reasons for that. And before long, you can see we're getting pretty close to the G word here. This is starting to sound like God caused the universe. Now, he didn't want to go there. All right, fine. Then what is your only other alternative? And notice how I'm prosecuting this using questions. What is your only other alternative? Since you don't want to say something caused the universe, then you have to say that no thing caused the universe. But this is hard to say, because that's worse than magic. In magic, you have a magician who pulls a rabbit out of a hat. Here you have no hat, and you have no magician. You just have the rabbit, the universe coming into existence. This is wildly counterintuitive. When a wife comes home from work and sees a new Mercedes SL sitting in the garage, she asks her husband, honey, where'd that Mercedes come from? He said, I don't know, honey, it just popped into existence out of nothing for no reason. If you were his wife, would you buy that? No, of course not. This is not reasonable. Now, maybe somebody might say, it's possible. Okay, I'm not going to argue with that. We're not trying to convince them that our view is absolutely necessary that God exists and created the universe. We just want to show them that it's the odds-on favorite. And that's what I'm doing here. Notice how I make this case, though. I'm using Columbo number 3 to make a point. The point is, in this case, that God exists. But I have to know the reason, or some reasons why God exists, and I have to know how to work through that argument, and I use the questions to get as many pieces on the table as I can, and then I use them to go to my ending and then see what he says, okay? So that's one way of using the Columbo tactic, Columbo number 3, and that is by making a point, all right? Another way of using Columbo is to use your questions to exploit a weakness or a flaw, okay? So in the third use of Columbo, you can use it to advance a point, or if you see something wrong in somebody's point of view, you don't want to point it out directly, you want to use a question to get there if you can. Now again, you have to know what's wrong with their view, and how do you know that? Well, a lot of times it just requires you to concentrate, pay attention, and think about what's being said, and see if the things, we know what they think, and we know why they think it. We got to see whether those two connect. Are the reasons adequate to the task of the point of view that they're defending? Okay? That's the real issue here. Now, it may be that you don't know what's wrong. And again, then you're just going to have to just let it lie for the moment. But these are the kinds of things that we can learn in the books. Here is the place we put that book learning into play. Okay? There's no special formula here. You just got to be alert. All right? Listen carefully. Think about what was said. Okay? Once you've done that, once you've seen what the error happens to be, you want to try to exploit this error again by using Columbo, where you want to use a question. And this Columbo number 3, it does take a little bit more practice than the others, but in time, you'll improve. It requires a little bit of insight. It isn't always easy, but you'll find yourself getting there as time goes on. So don't be discouraged, all right? Once you find a challenge or a flaw that you want to exploit, you want to get the parts on the table exactly the same way and use those pieces to make your point. Now, the examples are the best way to learn this. So how about this? Somebody says you're intolerant. And this is the kind of thing, or you're bigoted, or you're narrow-minded, or whatever. This is the kind of thing that happens all the time in public conversation with people who don't like your point of view. And instead of dealing with the point of view, they'll just call you a name. Now, you might say it sometimes to the other person, look, ridicule's not an argument, which would be a fair thing to say. But in this particular case, we're going to respond by using what? Questions, okay? We're going to use our Columbo tactic. And when somebody calls you intolerant, the first thing that I recommend that you do, whenever they call you any name, is you ask them the first Columbo question. What do you mean by that? That is, what am I doing right now that makes you think that I'm somebody who has this vice called intolerance? And he says, well, you think you're right. And this is generally what's motivating this challenge. You think you're right, and you think everybody else is wrong. Okay, what do you think? Do you think that when I advance a point of view, do you think that I think I'm right? Of course I do. That's why I believe what I do. I believe it's true. If I didn't believe what I believe was true, I wouldn't believe it. I'd believe something else and think that was true instead. But I'm not the only one in this conversation that believes he's right, and that's the point I want you to get. He's getting on my case because I think I'm right, but guess what? That person thinks he's right too. And so now I have another question. Yes, I think I'm right, but I could be mistaken. I'm willing to say that, but let me ask you a question. Do you think you're right? And what's he going to say? I'm wrong about everything I believe? No, he's going to say, yeah, of course I think I'm right. Now, once in a while, people will say, well, I think I'm right for me, and they'll do that, the relativist two-step there. And if they say, well, I'm just right for me, then you say, well, then why are you talking to me right now? Sounds to me like you're correcting me. I'm doing something wrong. You got it right. I got it wrong. You want me to believe like you believe. So the fact is he does think he's right. Okay, now I've got my third question. Okay, I know how this works. I got it in my mind. I'm using questions to get to a point. He says, you're intolerant. I say, what do you mean by that? He said, you think you're right. Well, yeah, I do. But let me ask you a question. Do you think you're right? Yeah, of course he does. Here's my final question. Why is it that when I think I'm right, I'm intolerant? But when you think you're right, you're just right. What am I missing here? Now, I say that to him, but I'm not missing anything. I know what's going on here. He has reduced our conversation to common name calling. He is just calling me a name. He's calling me intolerant or bigoted or whatever it happens to be. And he's using that to substitute for reasonable conversation. What if I turned to him when he called me intolerant and I said, well, you're ugly. and your mom dresses you funny. Now, I wouldn't say that kind of thing because it's not polite and it's not on point. The guy could be really ugly and really right. Has nothing to do with it. Why am I going through this conversation with him this way? I'm trying to show him his flaw, that he is just simply resorting to name calling to make a point, which is bad manners and bad thinking. And I want him to get back on the point. Whenever anybody shifts the conversation to attacking the person rather than attacking the point, you know they've made a mistake. And this is a mistake you can exploit with a little thoughtful, advanced questioning and hopefully help that person to see where they're making their mistake. So there's one example of using Columbo number 3 to exploit a weakness or a flaw. Here's another one. This is on the abortion issue. I was at a conference many years ago. We had a table with product on it. And a gentleman came up to the table, a Christian. And he said, well, I believe personally that abortion is wrong. That's my personal belief. But I don't think we should be forcing that on other people. Okay? So this is called the modified pro-choice position, and you probably heard politicians use this. Any so-called modification of the pro-choice position is always pro-choice, just to let you know. There is no such thing. Okay, but that's what they call this, okay? I'm personally against it, but I think that I shouldn't be pushing my views on other people. Okay, so this is the place where you need to ask your first Columbo question. What do you mean by that? And what I said to that man in this particular case is, why are you personally against it? I need a piece of information there. Why are you personally against abortion? You say you're against it. Why are you personally against it? Here's what he said to me. He said, because I think abortion takes the life of an innocent human being. And that's why I would never have an abortion. Okay, so now I got what I needed. And here's what I said to him. Let me just repeat back to you what I thought I heard you say. And you tell me what you think of it, okay? You actually believe that abortion kills an innocent human child. And you also think that women should be allowed to do this to their children. Is that right? Now, he started shuffling back and forth. And, well, what he said was, well, if you put it that way. I said, put it what way? That's your view. Am I distorting it? If I'm distorting it, you let me know. But that's what I thought I heard. And that is what I heard. And that is his view. And that's why that kind of view, the modified pro-choice position, is barbaric. If you actually believe that abortion kills an innocent human being, why would you think anybody should be allowed to do that kind of thing? Why would you not enforce that kind of thing? So what did I do? I used Columbo number 3. I was aware of a weakness. And because I was aware of the weakness, I could see how I wanted to get to my point, that the so-called modified pro-choice position was a bad point of view. Okay? And then I asked some questions to help, actually to get him to help me get to this point. And he was stuck. He couldn't go any further. Now, did I corner him? Yes. Did I trap him? Yes. But it was completely legitimate. Okay, so that gives you an idea how to use Columbo, number 3, by using questions to make a point. Whether the point is your own point of view or the point you want to make is exploiting a weakness or a flaw. Now I want to talk for a few moments about how to improve your Columbo skill. How do you get better at this? I think the best way to improve your Columbo skills is to work on the challenges when the pressure's off. Now, when is the pressure going to be off? It's not when you're talking to somebody. That's the pressure is on. It's either going to be before or after. So that's going to give us some insight as to how to best improve. And I want you to think about 3 words. Anticipate. That is before your event, before your conversation, anticipate. Reflect. That's afterwards. And practice. Anticipate, reflect, and practice, or role play, if you will. In other words, what you want to try to do, in some cases, is to anticipate objections and think of questions in advance. I mean, maybe you've had some things that have stumped you. You've engaged with somebody before, and they've just caught you by surprise. You haven't known how to respond to that issue. Well, figure out what the right response is. Do your research. find out a response to it, and now what you do is you figure out the right questions that will help you get to that point. Okay? Once you figure out the questions that will get you to that point, then do a little role play. Practice it out loud with somebody else, by yourself. I do it in the car all the time. I'm thinking, oh, what would he say to me? Well, he'd say this, but then I'd say this, but then he'd say that, then I would say this. And I'd ask him this question. I just practice it. Because if you're practicing it out loud, you're role playing it, you're actually getting in the habit of using it. It'll be much more second nature next time around. Okay? So you might anticipate in advance. Sometimes you reflect afterwards. Sometimes you go into a situation and you come out and you think, oh my gosh, I made a mess of that. And you think to yourself, well, what question might I have asked if I was on top of things? I actually gave this teaching in the tactical teaching in a church once, and as I went into the foyer, and I escaped underneath the prayer at the end of the service so I could be there when people were coming out, the first woman that came out said to me, I'm a Christian, and I'm a Buddhist, and I'm a pagan. That's what she said. Now, remember, I just finished talking about Columbo tactic. So you're thinking, what question would he come up with for that challenge? Well, here's what I said. It sounds to me like you really don't understand those three religions. Is that a question? No, it's an insult. Now, fortunately, she didn't get bugged at me, but she might have. She said, well, I do think I understand those. And then I kind of got my wits about me. And then I asked the question, I should have asked it first. And that was, what do you think Jesus would say regarding your comment that she's a Christian and a Buddhist and a pagan? And she said to me, well, I think Jesus would be just fine with it. And then the crowd comes through and sweeps her away. Okay, so I recovered a little bit. Just to let you know, I make mistakes in this too. I'm in the process. But I recovered a little bit, asked a good question, but didn't have time for a follow-up. But I did think afterwards about what I might have asked. She said, I think Jesus would have been fine with that. Oh, okay, now what? Then I realized I could have asked this. Maybe you've already thought about it. Where in the Gospels can you point to where Jesus said anything that would give you that impression? Now, I know the Gospels have no place in them where Jesus would suggest such a thing. He was a Torah-observant Jew. He was not a pluralist. He was the one who said, it's the narrow gate, not the wide gate. The narrow gate to salvation, the wide gate leads to destruction. Okay? So Jesus was narrow. But notice how I came up with that after the conversation was over. So I reflected back. So how do you improve your Columbo technique? Either you prepare in advance and then you role play it. That is, you figure out an answer to a challenge and the questions that will help you deal with the challenge, and you role play it. Or you come off a bad performance, think about how badly you did, and then you ask yourself, well, what could I have done to improve under those circumstances? And then you offer that angle, but also by questions. Figure out the questions for that, and then role play it, okay? Now, let me underscore the significance of practice. It increases your practical experience because you're actually going through the dialogue, but you're doing it in a safe environment. So try to anticipate maybe the turns or approach that your other person might take in conversation. Anticipate how you'd respond and what they might say in response, and then role play out loud if possible, and let the ideas sink in a little bit. And I tell you, if you practice in advance, when these issues come up, you'll be ready because you've already rehearsed your response to them. It really works. I mean, take my word for it. It really works. It's the same way, by the way, political candidates prepare for televised debates, or comedians prepare for their spontaneous kind of funnies on talk shows. They come in and how are these guys so funny when just at the drop of a pin? But that isn't the way it happens. It happens because they practiced in advance. So now I want to talk just towards the end here about how you can defend against Columbo, because I know some of you are thinking, now, this is a great thing. I can see how I can be in the driver's seat of the conversation. I can use these questions and really make progress. But what if somebody uses Columbo against me? All right, now we said there are three parts to Columbo. Columbo number one, gathering information. What do you mean by that? Do you think I'm afraid of that question? I'm not afraid of that question. I like telling people what I mean by that. And plus, I've given some thought to what I mean by that. So you shouldn't have any problem with Columbo number 1. What about Columbo number 2? The second use of Columbo, reversing the burden of proof. And the question is, how'd you come to that conclusion? Do you think I'm scared of that problem? No, I love it when people ask me how I came to the conclusion, because I have come to conclusions about things. I know the reasons why I believe. And so I'm not concerned about that at all. And neither should you be if you're a good student of Christianity. It's the third one you have to worry about, because sometimes Columbo number 3 can be used against you in a manipulative kind of way. That is, the other person is going on the offensive against you, and they're asking questions that you sense are meant to set you up or trap you, so he can exploit what he thinks are weaknesses in your own view. Now, I encourage you to do this because I'm trusting your charity in doing it, that you're not doing something illicit or inappropriate, or you're not just trying to make them look bad. But you can't trust other people in the same way, because sometimes they're just trying to make you look bad. So how do you keep from being taken advantage of, I guess is the best way of putting it in this situation? Well, here's what I suggest. First, you stop the advance, okay? You might say something like, well, as he's asking questions and wants you to answer, and you're starting to wonder, is he leading me down the primrose path? You could say, you're asking a lot of questions here, and sometimes it confuses me, because I get the feeling that you don't really want to know the answers to the questions, but you just want to know, want me to kind of commit myself because you're going somewhere else. You're going to make a point down the line. And that makes me a little uneasy. So I'd rather not answer a lot of questions at this particular point, if that's okay with you. So the first thing you're doing is you're just stopping the advance. The second thing you do is you want to regain control. You want to get back in the driver's seat, because he's in the driver's seat with his questions, right? So you want to get back in control. And so you can say this to him. Why don't you just simply state your point? What do you mean by that? State it clearly so I don't misunderstand it. And then give me your specific reasons. That's Columbo number 2. How'd you come to that conclusion for your view? See how flexible these questions are, okay? And then let me chew on it for a while and see what I think. Now that's the way to protect yourself. This is very similar to getting out of the hot seat, but you're not quite in it yet. You just get in the feeling that he's asking these questions and you're going to get in trouble if you are not careful. So then you just put a halt to it. You say, it seems like you're trying to make a point with the questions. That's kind of confusing for me. I'm not exactly sure how to respond all the time, but why don't you just make the point? Say what you mean and why you believe it, and that'll be fine, and I'll think about it. All right? So let's review what we've covered here in this session. First, we learned the third use of Columbo. We're going to use questions to make a point or to lead someone somewhere. We want to exploit a weakness or a flaw, or maybe make a point about our own point of view. Okay, I told you the way to do this is you're going to have to, in your own mind, know the point. You're going to have to solve the problem and know the pieces that you have that you need to get there. And as much as possible, it's not always going to be ideal to do this, but as much as possible, get them to put the pieces on the table by the questions that you ask. Okay, you get that all on the table, and then you use those pieces that the person you're talking with helped put there. And you use those pieces to make your point. The second thing we learned was how to improve your Columbo skill. I gave you 3 words: anticipate, reflect, and practice. And these are very simple to keep in mind. Either before you anticipate the problems, or after you you take a look at what you've done and reflect on how badly you did. In either of those cases, the pressure's off. So you can work on those issues and then work on the questions that can get you where you want them to take you. And then role play it. This is really important. And the more you role play it, the more natural it's going to become. And then finally, we learned how to defend against the Columbo tactic when it's used against you. The first question of Columbo, you shouldn't have to worry about it. The second question of Columbo, you shouldn't have to worry about it. But the third one, where they're using questions to lead you, then you want to stop the advance. You want to say, well, why don't you just make your point and let me respond to it? So you're stopping the advance, then you're regaining control by asking him to change his approach, but still giving him a chance to make his point, okay? So that's how that works. Now, I want you to do some homework before your next session. Here's what I want you to do in the next few days or week, whatever. I want you to find a friend or two, and I want you to teach them the basics of Columbo 1, 2, and 3. You know it's not that hard. I've already given it to you. You've got notebook right there you can use. Let them know what you're learning, how it's helping you, and explain to them the basic facts. Walk through them as best you can. And encourage them to just start using Columbo number 1 to get used to it, gathering information. And they can do that for a week or two to get kind of rolling. And if you teach it to them, I guarantee you, you're going to learn it better for yourself. Now, in our next session, we'll learn one good way to discover a certain type of weakness or a flaw. I call that tactic the suicide tactic, and we'll talk about it then.
So what do you guys think? I think he makes a good point. He talked about it, the getting out of the hot seat earlier. I think let me think about it is really a good response, because there's times where you feel like you're getting overwhelmed. Yeah, let's talk about it. It's what he calls the steamroller. We'll get to that in a later session, but we don't have to engage, just like the other person doesn't have to engage, and we shouldn't force ourselves on them either. If they are wanting a way out, we should leave them with the nugget and let it go, because if you push harder, you usually don't have success. I think the real power to his approach is non-combative, conversational, and it's cordial, right? It's supposed to be a give and a take of a conversation, and stay away from the lecture type approach. So good. All right. So page 55.
We're more good than Christians too when you're discussing stuff.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Well, because, okay, for instance, okay, I got my doctorate degree in a certain thing, and I'm telling you about it. You don't have the same background I just had. At a certain point, can you just tell me what's going on, and then let me marinate on it, let's get back together and talk about it. Don't let someone steamroll you because they've thought it completely through, and you haven't had a chance.
Right.
You want to be, we're always on the search for truth together. We're not trying to convince somebody per se, we're trying to discover the truth together. And I think we have to make sure we're doing it in the right spirit. Because we can be sure we're right and still be wrong.
Until you don't know, until somebody points your blinders.
Yeah, well,
Everybody has blinders.
yeah.
And takes angles stuff you've never thought of before. So if you're not open to listening to others, like, okay, whether there's a point there, or it's like it's nonsense until you really process it through.
Yeah, I think seeing it through other people's perspectives is a real valuable technique for us as Christians, because one, it helps us to see the flaws in someone else's perspective, so we can help them see the flaws in their perspective if there is one. It also helps us to see the flaws in our perspective, and we often have flaws. At least I know I do.